I'm watching them auction off Brenda's house. She was the HOA president who used a forged document to illegally sell my 1,000-acre family farm to a developer. They thought I was just some dumb 68-year-old farmer they could roll over. They didn't know I spent 20 years as a land surveyor before I came home to work this land. Brenda thought she was stealing my family's legacy, but she was really just signing over the deed to her own home, and every single one of her neighbors. So how'd I do it? This story is crazy. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It all started, as these things often do, with the grass. Not my grass, you understand? My pastures are for grazing cattle, not for manicured putting greens. No, it started with the grass on the other side of my fence, the chemically vibrant, obsessively edged turf of the Whispering Pines estates. When the development first went up about 10 years ago, I didn't pay it much mind. I've seen the city creep closer my whole life. My farm, a sprawling 1,000 acres of rolling hills, ancient oaks, and fertile soil, was a holdout from a different era, an island of green in a rising tide of beige stucco. My wife, Martha, had passed 5 years before they broke ground, and I suppose, in a way, the solitude of the farm was my only real companion. I knew the land like the back of my hand, every dip, every creek bed, every spot where the deer would shelter in a storm. It was more than property. It was a living record of my family, of my life. The new neighbors were mostly fine at first. They were city people, chasing a fantasy of country, living without the mud or the manure. They'd wave from their oversized SUVs as I chugged by on my John Deere. But then, about 2 years ago, a new queen ascended. The throne of the HOA board, her name was Brenda. Brenda was in her early 50s, with a face permanently pinched in a state of disapproval and a voice that could curdle milk. She drove a white Range Rover and seemed to believe the HOA's jurisdiction extended to the very air we breathed. Our first real interaction was about my barn. It's 100 years old, painted a classic red, and admittedly, it leans a bit to the west. It has character. Brenda called it an eyesore that was negatively impacting the aesthetic harmony of her community. I remember chuckling as I listened to her voicemail. I told her, as politely as I could, that my barn had been there long before her aesthetic harmony was a blueprint and had planned on being there long after. That was my first mistake. I had treated her like a minor annoyance, but in her mind I had just declared war. The complaints started flooding in. My tractor was too loud, too early in the morning. The smell of my cows was offensive to the senses. My fence line, the very same fence that kept my livestock from wandering onto her precious lawns, was not up to the HOA's visual standards. Each complaint was delivered in a crisp white envelope, a formal declaration of her imagined authority. I ignored most of them. I was a farmer living on unincorporated county land. Her little club had no power over me, and I knew it. But Brenda was a creature of relentless, malignant ambition. If one path was blocked, she'd simply bulldoze another. She began to see my farm not as a neighboring property, but as a personal insult. 1,000 acres of untamed reality mocking her sterile, rule-bound paradise. At an HOA barbecue I wasn't invited to, I only heard about it from a more reasonable neighbor named George. Brenda apparently gave a speech. George told me she stood on a patio overlooking my western pasture, a glass of Chardonnay in her hand, and spoke of a vision. A vision of a championship golf course, a sparkling community lake, and a new phase of luxury homes, all where my dilapidated farm currently stood. She called it unlocking the potential of the community's green space. It wasn't her green space. It was my green space. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I thought it was just wine-fueled fantasy, the ramblings of a power-drunk suburbanite. I vastly, tragically underestimated her. I failed to grasp that for someone like Brenda, reality is just an obstacle to be managed and laws are just suggestions for other people. Her obsession began to take a more sinister turn. I'd see her Range Rover parked on the road beside my property line, Brenda sitting in the driver's seat, just staring. Sometimes she'd have a man with her, someone in a suit who would point and take notes. I learned later this was the HOS lawyer, a man whose ethics were as flexible as his billing rates. They were hunting, and the prey they were stalking was my entire world. The first official shot across the bow came in the form of a certified letter. It was thick, heavy with the self-importance of the paper inside. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the same table my father and grandfather sat at, and slitting the envelope open with a dull knife. The letter was a masterpiece of convoluted legalese, but the message was brutally simple. The Whispering Pines homeowners. Association was laying a formal claim to a 500-foot wide swath of my land along the entire 2-mile border we shared. They claimed this was a historical community easement intended for a future access road and greenbelt. Citing an obscure county planning document from the 1970s, I knew it was nonsense. I had my deed clear as day with property lines surveyed and recorded. I still had the original survey markers my father had shown me as a boy. I called my lawyer, a decent fellow named Tom, who mostly handled wills and trusts, but who understood property law. He was as baffled as I was. He reviewed my deed and the HOS claim. "Arthur," he said over the phone, his voice a mix of confusion and anger, "this is garbage. The document they're citing was a preliminary zoning proposal that was rejected by the county board. It has no legal weight. It's a ghost." We drafted a firm, unequivocal response, complete with a copy of my deed and the official county record showing the 1970s proposal had been denied. We sent it back, assuming that would be the end of it. We assumed we were dealing with rational people. That was our second mistake. Brenda didn't want a 500-foot strip of land. That was just the opening salvo, a test to see how I'd react. What she wanted was everything. Her next move was far more insidious. Instead of fighting me on the easement, she and her lawyer went deeper, digging through a century of records, desperate to find a crack in my family's foundation. And they found one. Or rather, they found something they could twist into the shape of one. Back in 1912, when my great-grandfather bought this land, the entire region was a patchwork of large agricultural grants. The original survey of the county was, to put it mildly, a bit rustic. Surveyors used oak trees and creek bends as markers. In one of the old plat maps, a surveyor had made a note about a potential ambiguity in the western parcel, the 1,000 acres that became my farm, suggesting it might be considered unallocated territory of the original township grant if not actively homesteaded. This note was corrected in a 1925 resurvey, and my great-grandfather's deed, and my grandfather's and my father's and mine, were all issued based on that corrected, legally binding survey. For 100 years, my family had paid taxes on, worked, and lived on that land. It was, in every legal and moral sense, ours. But for Brenda, that 1912 surveyor's note was a key. She and her lawyer, a weasel named Peterson, built a fraudulent case around it. They argued that the 1925 correction was improperly filed, a lie, and that, therefore, the land was never officially deeded to my family. They claimed it remained public land, which, through a series of legal contortions and a friendly county clerk who was a member of their they had the Whispering Pines development annexed as adjacent community property. It was a breathtaking act of legal fraud. They held a special, closed-door HOA meeting. Not all residents were notified. My friend George only found out about it after the fact. With a hand-picked quorum of her supporters, Brenda presented her findings. She told them she had discovered the HOA had a legal right to this massive tract of land, that it was a forgotten asset. She painted a picture of a luxury golf course, rising property values, and exclusive amenities. They voted unanimously to reclaim the land. Then, moving with shocking speed, they sold it. They sold my 1,000 acres to a major resort developer for pennies on the dollar, an absurdly low price that screamed backroom deal. The developer, eager for a bargain, didn't perform due diligence, relying on the fraudulent title documents Peterson had cooked up. The day I found out is burned into my memory. I saw bulldozers and surveyors, not mine, at the edge of my southern pasture. I drove out. There, my heart pounding in my chest. A foreman, a young man with a sunburned neck, handed me a piece of paper. It was a cease and desist order accusing me of trespassing. It bore the letterhead of the Whispering Pines H. I drove straight to Brenda's house. Her Range Rover was in the driveway. She answered the door holding a glass of iced tea, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if I were a stranger. I held up the paper, my hand shaking with rage. "What is this, Brenda? What have you done?" She didn't flinch. "We have reclaimed what is rightfully community property, Mr. Henderson. The land was never truly yours. You've been squatting for quite some time, it seems? The new owners will be taking possession immediately. I'd advise you to remove your personal effects." I stared at her, the sheer, unadulterated evil of it washing over me. She hadn't just stolen my land. She had stolen my history, my identity, my future. She was trying to erase me. "This won't stand," I said, my voice low. "You have no idea what you've done." She laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. Oh, I think I do. I've just increased the value of every home in this neighborhood. And there's nothing you, an old man with a rusty tractor, can do about it. That was her third and most critical mistake. She saw an old man. She didn't see the son of a man who taught me that the only thing more valuable than land is the knowledge of how to keep it. And she certainly didn't see the retired land surveyor who knew every dirty trick in the book, because I'd spent a career fighting people just like her on behalf of honest folks. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. For the first few days, I was in a state of shock. I wandered the farmhouse, the silence of it pressing in on me. I'd look out the window at the fields my father taught me to plow, at the creek where I taught my own son to fish before I lost him, and a cold, hard fury began to replace the despair. Brenda's words echoed in my head. An old man with a rusty tractor. It was meant to be an insult, a dismissal, but she was right about one thing. I was an old man. And old men have two things young, impatient people like her don't: time and a profound, bone-deep understanding of how the world really works. My first call wasn't to my lawyer, Tom. He was a good man, but this was no longer a simple property dispute. This was a declaration of total war, fought with fraudulent documents and corrupt officials. This required a specialist. I cashed in some old investments and hired the best and most ruthless real estate litigation firm in the state. I met with a partner named Marcus Thorne, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than my truck. He listened to my story without interruption, his face a granite mask. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice calm and precise, "what they have done is not just illegal, it is a felony. Title fraud, conspiracy, likely bribery, but the courts are slow. The injunction to stop the developers will take time to get. While I begin that process, we need to find a lever. Something we can use to apply immediate and overwhelming pressure. We need to fight dirty, because they've left us no other choice." And that's when I told him about my past. About the 20 years I spent as a professional land surveyor for the state before my father's health failed and I came home to run the farm. I told him I knew how to read the deep history of the land, not just in the soil, but in the ink of forgotten ledgers and the faded lines of ancient maps stored in the basement of the county courthouse. Marcus's eyes lit up. "Go," he said, "go to the archives. Don't look for the evidence to prove your case. We already have that. Look for the evidence to destroy theirs. Find the document they never knew existed. Find their apocalypse." That's exactly what I did. For the next 3 weeks, the county records office became my second home. I wasn't just some angry farmer. I was a man on a mission with a skill set Brenda could never have imagined. I knew the systems, the cataloging quirks, the places where the real history was hidden. The clerks who initially saw me as a nuisance began to respect my quiet, methodical work. I pulled every deed, every plat map, every zoning variance, and every township charter related to this entire quadrant of the county, going back to the original land grants of the 1880s. I wasn't just looking at my farm. I was examining the history of the land that Whispering Pines was built on. Peterson and Brenda had been sloppy. Their fraud was built on a single out-of-context document. My case would be built on a mountain of irrefutable truth. I found the original 1925 resurvey document they claimed was improperly filed. Attached to it, missed by their hurried search, was a signed affidavit from the county magistrate at the time, confirming its legality and permanently striking the 1912 surveyor's note from the record. That was my first smoking gun. It proved definitively that their entire claim was based on a known and legally rectified error. Next, I investigated the developer. A few discreet inquiries revealed they were a subsidiary of a larger corporation known for its aggressive tactics and for cozying up to local officials. I cross-referenced their campaign donations for the last county election. Unsurprisingly, the county clerk who had so quickly approved Brenda's fraudulent title annexation had received a very generous and barely legal donation from a PAC connected to the developer's parent company. That was the bribery Marcus had suspected. But I still hadn't found the apocalypse. I knew it had to be. There, in these old counties, land rights are a complex tapestry woven over generations. Developers like the ones who built Whispering Pines only care about the surface. They rarely look at the deep history. On the 15th day, covered in dust in a forgotten corner of the sub-basement, I found it. It was a massive, leather-bound book titled Township Grant and Covenant Registry, 1880 to 1920. Inside, tied to the original agricultural grant from which both my farm and the Whispering Pines land were eventually subdivided, was a covenant. An ironclad, permanent land use covenant put in place by the original founding family of the county. The covenant was designed to protect the region's agricultural character. It stated, in archaic but legally precise language, that any parcel of land subdivided from the original grant for non-agricultural purposes was bound by a specific condition. The new community built on that land had a perpetual obligation to support the agricultural integrity of the remaining grant lands. It was a bit vague, but the next clause was anything but. It stipulated that if any action was taken by the owners of the subdivided, non-agricultural land that willfully and maliciously damages the commercial viability or rightful ownership of the primary agricultural holder, two things would happen. First, an automatic and punitive lien would be placed on every property within the offending subdivision. Second, the title to those properties would become subordinate to the title of the original grant holder, meaning me, the direct heir, until a massive financial penalty was paid directly to the grant holder's estate. It was a legal nuke. A poison pill left behind by a patriarch a century ago to protect his legacy. The developers of Whispering Pines had either never found it or, more likely, had their lawyers dismiss it as an archaic, unenforceable relic. But my new lawyer, Marcus, knew better. He knew that in our state, these old covenants, if properly filed, were terrifyingly binding. And this one was filed perfectly cross-referenced with the original grant deed. Brenda, in her arrogant attempt to steal my 1,000 acres, had unknowingly triggered a legal, self-destruct mechanism that targeted every single home in her precious, perfect community. She thought she was playing checkers with an old farmer. She was about to find out I was playing a three-dimensional chess game, and I had just found my checkmate. I photocopied every page, my hands steady, a cold, grim satisfaction settling over me. The war wasn't just about getting my land back anymore. It was about righteous, biblical retribution. Armed with a briefcase full of meticulously organized evidence, I returned to Marcus Thorne's office. I laid it all out on his vast mahogany desk, the certified 1925 resurvey that nullified their claim, the proof of the county clerk's campaign donation, and finally, the covenant from the 1880s. I watched his face as he read the covenant. A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming. "Mr. Henderson," he said, "you found your apocalypse. This is one of the most beautiful legal instruments I have ever seen. It's a work of art." He explained the strategy. It would be a two-pronged attack. First, we would file the emergency injunction to stop the developers using the 1925 resurvey as a battering ram. The evidence of fraud was so blatant that no judge could ignore it. The developer, faced with building on a fraudulent title and being implicated in a bribery scheme, would likely abandon the project and sue the HOA into oblivion for misleading them. That was the simple part. The second prong was the covenant. "This," Marcus said, tapping the brittle photocopy, "is our leverage. We don't just sue the HOA. The HOA is a flimsy corporate shell with no real assets besides the dues it collects. We sue every single homeowner in Whispering Pines. The covenant makes them all individually and collectively liable for the board's actions. Their homes, their personal assets are now on the table. The plan was brutal, but it was just they, through their elected board, had tried to render me homeless and penniless. The covenant was simply turning their own weapon back on them. The first phase went exactly as planned. Marcus filed the injunction. The developer's high-priced legal team took one look at our evidence of title fraud and the potential bribery scandal and immediately folded. They halted all work on my land and filed a massive lawsuit against the Whispering Pines HOA for breach of contract and fraud. The news sent a shockwave through the community. I heard from my neighbor George that there was a panic. Brenda tried to control the narrative. She held an emergency community meeting and fed them a story about a minor clerical error that was being sorted out. She assured them their investment in the new golf course was safe and that the disgruntled farmer next door was just making a fuss, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Then we unleashed Phase 2. One by one, every single one of the 250 homeowners in Whispering Pines was served with a lawsuit. It named them, personally, as defendants in the case of Henderson v. Whispering Pines et al. The lawsuit demanded two things: the immediate restoration of my title, free and clear, and the payment of the punitive financial penalty as stipulated in the 1880s covenant. The penalty was calculated based on the covenant's formula, 10 times the assessed value of the land they had attempted to steal. The number was astronomical, well over $80 million. The lawsuit also included a lien application against every single property in the development. This meant that no one could sell or refinance their home until the case was settled. We had effectively frozen the entire community in a state of legal and financial paralysis. The reaction was volcanic. My phone started ringing. It was, "George, Arthur, it's chaos over here," he said, his voice strained. "People are screaming. They're terrified. They're saying you're trying to take their homes. Brenda is telling everyone you're a monster, a vindictive old man trying to ruin them." "Brenda is the one who did this, George," I said calmly. "Her greed and her arrogance triggered this. This covenant has been sitting there for 100 years, harmless. She's the one who woke the sleeping dragon." I instructed Marcus to include a letter with the legal filings, a personal explanation from me. It laid out the facts in simple, clear language. It explained how their HOA board, led by Brenda, had committed felony title fraud, and how their actions had triggered a century-old protective covenant. I made it clear my fight was not with them, but with the board that had lied to them and gambled with their homes. I offered them a way out, remove the current board, formally recognize my ownership, and sign a settlement, acknowledging the HOA's wrongdoing. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit against the individual homeowners, and we could negotiate a more reasonable settlement with the newly structured HOA. I was giving them a choice: side with the woman who had led them to ruin, or side with the man who was offering them a lifeline. The community fractured. A faction, led by Brenda and her cronies, doubled down. They called me a liar and a thief. They hired Peterson, the same crooked liar, to fight me, using HOA funds to do it. But another, larger group of homeowners were scared and angry. They started asking questions. They demanded to see the documents Brenda had used. They started talking to my friend George, who told them what he knew. The pressure on Brenda was mounting. She called one last defiant community meeting in the Whispering Pines clubhouse. This time I was invited by the faction of residents who wanted answers. Marcus advised me against it. But I knew I had to go. I had to face her and them directly. I put on a clean shirt and my old jacket, and for the first time in 10 years, I walked across the property line and into the heart of their world. The clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with fear and anger. It felt like a town hall meeting on the eve of a revolution. I saw Brenda standing at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by her Lawyer, Peterson, and the other board members. She looked haggard, the mask of smug superiority cracking under the strain. I took a seat in the back, next to George. All eyes were on me. I was the villain of their story, the boogeyman who had come to steal their homes. Brenda tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice tight. "As you know, our community has been targeted by a frivolous and malicious lawsuit. Mr. Henderson," she said, pointing a trembling finger at me, "is attempting to use an archaic, irrelevant document to extort money from us and seize our property." Peterson, the lawyer, stepped forward. "We are confident that this so-called covenant will be thrown out of court," he said, his voice oozing a false confidence. "It is an unenforceable relic. We urge you to stand strong with your board. We will defeat this." Then a man in the front row stood up. He was a retired accountant I recognized from the neighborhood. "With all due respect," he said, his voice shaking but firm, "many of us have had our own lawyers look at this, and they're telling us it's very enforceable. They're telling us we are in serious financial jeopardy because of the actions of this board." A woman stood up. "You told us the golf course was a done deal. You used our dues to push this through. Did you even perform due diligence? Did you know about this covenant?" Brenda's face flushed. "We acted on the advice of counsel. We acted in the best interest of the community," the room erupted. People were shouting, demanding answers. The narrative Brenda had so carefully constructed was disintegrating before her very eyes. Finally, George stood up beside me. "Quiet down," he yelled, and a hush fell over the room. "Arthur is here. Why don't we let him speak?" All heads turned to me. I walked slowly to the front of the room, not to the podium, but just to stand on the floor in front of them. I looked out at their faces, a sea of anxiety and confusion. "My name is Arthur Henderson," I said, my voice steady and clear. "My family has owned the land next to yours for over 140 years. I was born in the house I live in today. I have never asked for anything from this community except to be left alone. Your board president, Brenda, was not content with that. She tried to steal my home, my land, and my family's legacy through fraud and deceit. I held up a copy of the 1925 resurvey. This is the public record proving my ownership, a document your board deliberately ignored. I then held up the evidence of the developer's payment to the county clerk. And this suggests why they felt so confident they could get away with it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. And this, I said, holding up. The covenant is the consequence? This document was created to protect my family's land from exactly this kind of predatory action. Your board's malicious attack on me triggered it. Your board is solely responsible for the lien on your homes. I did not want this fight, but I will finish it. I looked directly at Brenda. Her face was ashen. I offered you all a way out, I continued, speaking to the homeowners. I still will remove this board, elect new leadership that will act in good faith, formally and publicly renounce the fraudulent claim to my land, and my lawyers will work with your new board on a fair settlement for the damages I've incurred. My lawsuit against you, the individual homeowners, will be dropped. Your homes will be safe. I paused, letting the offer sink in. But if you continue to stand with her, if you continue to fund this fight with your HOA dues, then I will have no choice but to see this through in court. And when I win, and I will win, the judgment will be $80 million. The HOA will be bankrupted, and the court will satisfy that judgment the only way it can. By seizing and auctioning every single property in Whispering Pines. The choice is yours. The silence was deafening. I had laid the cards on the table. They could save themselves, but it would mean sacrificing their queen. The retired accountant stood up again. I call for a vote, he announced. A vote of no confidence in the current board, and for their immediate removal, effective now. The room exploded, not with chaos, but with a unified roar of aye. It was a landslide. Brenda stood there, stunned, as her reign evaporated in an instant. Peterson, the lawyer, was already packing his briefcase, slipping out a side door like the rat he was. The homeowners surrounded Brenda, not with violence but with cold, hard fury, demanding the financial records, demanding her resignation. She was swept away by the tide of their anger. I had won. I had turned her own community against her, using nothing but the truth. I walked out of the clubhouse and back onto my own land. The fight was over. Now, the justice and the revenge could begin. The aftermath was swift and brutal for the old guard of Whispering Pines. A new, temporary board was elected that night, with my neighbor George at its head. Their first official act was to formally and publicly withdraw all claims to my land and issue a written apology. Their second was to fire Peterson and hire a new, competent lawyer to oversee the settlement negotiations with Marcus and me. The lawsuit against the individual homeowners was dropped as promised. A massive wave of relief washed over the community, but it was quickly replaced by a simmering rage directed squarely at Brenda and her cohorts on the old board. The new board launched a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. What they found was staggering. Brenda hadn't just been arrogant, she'd been corrupt. She had used HOA funds to pay for personal legal advice, funneled money into consulting fees for shell companies owned by friends, and had accepted what amounted to a massive kickback from the developer disguised as a finder's fee for bringing them the deal on my land. The district attorney's office, prompted by our evidence of the bribery and the HOA's own audit, opened a criminal investigation. Brenda, her cronies, and the county clerk were all indicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. The house of cards she had built on a foundation of lies had completely collapsed. The settlement with the HOA was painful for them, but they had to pay my substantial legal fees, which Marcus Thorne's firm made sure were meticulously documented. They also had to pay a significant sum in damages, which I immediately used to establish a permanent agricultural conservation trust for my 1,000 acres. This legal armor would ensure that no developer, no matter how greedy, could ever try to touch my family's land again. It was my final victory, a promise to my ancestors and to the future that this land would remain what it was always meant to be. But the judgment from the developer's lawsuit and our own settlement still loomed over the HOA. They had no cash reserves to speak of. Thanks to Brenda's mismanagement, they were, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. The court, in order to settle the debts, had no choice but to enforce the lien. The HOA's only asset was the collective property of its members. The court-appointed receiver determined that the only way to satisfy the multi-million-dollar judgments was to begin liquidating assets, and so the auctions began. It wasn't my decision, but a direct and unavoidable consequence of Brenda's actions. It was the final, ironic twist of the knife. In trying to seize my property, she had forced the sale of her own. I'm leaning against my truck, watching as the auctioneer's voice rings out across the manicured lawn of Brenda's former kingdom. Her beige stucco palace, with its 3-car garage and perfectly pruned rose bush, is being sold to the highest bidder. I see the look on her face, a mixture of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred, all directed at me. She sees me watching, and for a moment I think she's going to scream at me, but she just deflates. A broken woman who gambled everything and lost. The house sells for a fraction of what she paid for it, the proceeds going directly to the court to pay the debts she incurred. Her house is the first, but it won't be the last. Several of her closest allies on the board, the ones who eagerly voted to steal my life's work, will see their homes on the auction block in the coming weeks. Many of the other residents, good people caught in the crossfire, are able to work with the banks and the new HOA board to clear their liens and keep their homes. The community is healing, slowly, painfully, but it will be a better, more honest place without its tyrant. As the auctioneer shouts, "Sold!" a quiet satisfaction settles over me. It's not joy. It's the quiet, grim feeling of a long war finally being over. The feeling of justice, hard-won and absolute. Brenda made one final, fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because I was old, I was weak. She assumed that because I was a farmer, I was simple. She never understood that a farmer's entire life is a battle of strategy and will against forces, far greater than an HOA board. We battle the weather, the markets, the passage of time itself. We are patient. We know the land. We know that what you sow, you will eventually reap. Brenda sowed greed and corruption, and today she is reaping the whirlwind. I turn the key in the ignition of my old Ford. The engine rumbles to life, a familiar and comforting sound. I take one last look at the scene, at the wreckage of a woman's ambition, and I head for home. The sun is setting over my western pasture, casting long shadows across the land. My land safe, whole, and finally at peace.